Welcome back to another episode of Growth Marketers Podcast. I'm Samuel Timothy.
And I'm Taylor Rowe. Today's episode, we talked about budgeting for 2022 or putting together your marketing budgets. And to be honest, it's probably about 3 podcasts in one. We got into a ton of different topics here, but I think really good topics around what we see in the industry in the B2B space, specifically dove into the manufacturing space and what we see companies doing right, what we see companies doing wrong, and how you as a manufacturing leader, as an executive, as a marketing leader, how you can go about putting some budgets together in a systematic way, in a scientific way that can ultimately help you reach your growth goals. So hopefully you enjoy the episode. Please give us a like, give us a subscribe, and let's dive right in.
So Taylor, I know usually between Q3, Q4, we have a lot of conversation with leadership within the organizations that are very proactive about their business, proactive about their growth, discussing around what to do in terms of investing into their future, investing into the upcoming year in terms of marketing and things of that nature. So we have a lot of those conversations all the time with business leaders, but we still keep getting the same question over and over again. How much should we invest into marketing? How much should we invest into our from a marketing standpoint for an organization that's in a growth mode? So we want to use this opportunity to kind of address those questions and see if we can shed some light on what business leaders need to think as they're planning for the future.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And like you said, this is a question that, since the beginning of marketing, right? It's like, how much do we spend on marketing? A lot of companies look at it in terms of like their percentage of their revenue, right? Which makes sense when you're, a business owner, you're looking at our total revenue and then you break down your budgets and it's all broken down by percentage, right? How much do we spend on overhead? How much do we spend on labor? How much do we spend on marketing? How much do we spend on new, whatever sort of big capital expenditures you have in terms of equipment, all those kind of things. And so that makes sense. So we looked up some stats around, what U.S. Small Business Administration recommends, other companies that have done a lot of studies on basically averages of what companies spend. And so we'll walk through some of these stats and then we'll kind of get into our thoughts on how we go around budget planning and what steps we take. So the first one from U.S. Small Business Administration, they recommend about 7 to 8% of your gross revenue for marketing and advertising. And this is based on companies doing $5 to $10 million in sales. So there's one stat there. Another study that we looked at from HubSpot recommended that specifically around manufacturing, obviously looking in the B2B space, manufacturers typically spend around 7%, 6.9% of their annual budget, or only 2.7% of their annual revenue on marketing. So that one's a little bit different. They're looking at, 7% of your total budget of what you're spending, which comes out to less than 3% of their total revenue. So that doesn't surprise me if you look at that comparison of all small businesses, B2B businesses spending 8% of gross revenue and manufacturing industry spending 3%. That's not surprising at all. We work with a lot of manufacturing companies out there. A lot of times they're a little bit conservative when it comes to their marketing spend. And so we see that happen. I also think you have to kind of take into account of basically how easy it is for you to get new customers or retain customers, right? A lot of manufacturing companies, a little bit old school, a little bit behind the times when it comes to getting new customers, but their customers stay around for a long time. So I think they have that advantage and they don't have to spend as much in order to just kind of maintain that status quo, which a lot of times, change can become scary, right? So increasing that marketing investment is seen as a risk to them, right? But in that same study, we did see that those stats were from 2019 before COVID. And then actually after COVID, that spend increased from 2.7% of total revenue to around 5% of total revenue. So I think that's a little bit promising. Obviously, manufacturing companies are investing more into digital marketing as, traditional trade shows, traditional marketing events have obviously declined and, gone away in a lot of cases because of COVID. And so I think manufacturing companies are starting to catch on to this idea of spending more on digital marketing in order to get in front of their ideal customers. What are your thoughts on those stats? Do those numbers seem low to you, high to you, based on, the companies that we work with?
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be from pretty much every article that we've looked at. That's about the average that everyone reports. But I think it also kind of is a reflection of how organizations sees marketing, right? If they do perceive it as an investment in the organization and that it is going to add to their top line growth, it's also going to help them establish themselves as a leader in the space, right? Building a strong brand presence, then those organizations probably are on the higher end of the spectrum of that spend. And then I think the ones that I just think, okay, we need to have a budget for marketing, so we're just going to take a small percentage of our revenue and put that toward marketing. That also reflects in the way that they consider marketing, right? Because when you talked about COVID, I was thinking many of the companies that actually did not value marketing probably cut marketing as their first budget to cut when they were probably cutting things, right? Because they're like, let's cut marketing. We don't need that. We need to keep our employees. We got to keep our lights on. Let's cut marketing. And I think that shows up how the company perceives marketing.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things within that, like you said, of how companies perceive marketing, especially within the manufacturing space. What I've noticed and what we've seen is there's a lot of companies that are successful in spite of bad marketing, right? And so they may be spending only 2% or 3% of their revenue on marketing, but it's not really netting anything for them. And so they're, $10 million, $20 million. I mean, we've worked with $100 million companies that really either spend nothing on marketing, or the marketing that they're doing is not true growth marketing in the sense of like there's no focus around acquiring new customers. It's kind of just, well, we have to advertise in this industry publication. We have to go to this trade show. We have to be listed on, Thomasnet or whatever that may be, just because that's what we do, right? It's just the way it is. It's just what we do. All our competitors are there. We go to these trade shows because our customers are there and we wine and dine them. And like that's the extent of their marketing. And so when they cut that spend, like you said, when times get tough, we cut that spend. They don't really see an impact on their business because it was never really driving new business in the first place. And so then we start to get a little bit complacent, or we misread that in the sense of we don't have to spend any marketing dollars on marketing because that's not the way we acquire customers. But it's always a bit of a catch-22 of that's not the way you acquire customers, or that's not the way your customers find you because you've never done it properly, right? It does not mean that your ideal customer or your total addressable market isn't bigger than what you think it is and that they're not influenced by marketing, right? Mm-hmm. So one thing I thought was interesting in that same study that talked about, yes, manufacturing companies are behind the times. They're increasing their marketing spend from 3% to 5% to 7% of their gross revenue. But why? And how do we justify that? If we're a $10 million company and we've been spending 1% or 2% of our revenue on marketing, how do we justify an increase when it's not really driving revenue? Well, you have to look at your customers and who they are. In that same study, we saw there was I'm just going to rattle through these stats because there's quite a few, but 84% of engineers consume content digitally. 71% of industrial buyers look at fewer than 5 suppliers before making a decision. Buyers spend just 17% of their time meeting with suppliers. 5 to 6% of that time is spent with one sales rep. 73% of buyers say they pay attention to your website first. 73% of buyers look at your website first. 53% of buyers expect a response to their inquiry within 24 hours. So you look at all that, right? 84% of engineers are consuming content digitally. 73% of them admitted that they look at the website first before they do anything. They're reaching out to, I think would be a handful of suppliers, 5 suppliers. This study is saying, hey, that's a relatively small number, which means, hey, you have to throw your hat in the ring, right? So that idea of we're just going to do the status quo and like we're suppliers for this industry. There's 50 of us. Everyone sends out a quote and we, send our RFQ back and hopefully we can win the deal. That's not really the case. They're spending a little bit more time doing research. They're looking online, right, to consume that content. They're looking at your website first, and they're going to reach out to a handful of people, and they expect a quick response to their inquiry, and ultimately that sales process is relatively quick. So yes, you can sit there and say our customers don't come to our website, they don't fill out the forms. That's not how we get customers, but it's because you're not even playing the same game, right? You're not even in the conversation because all of this is happening, and they're reaching out to 3 or 4 of your competitors, and they're never reaching out to you because they can't find you, because you're not investing into the marketing that you need to be. So all that to say is that there certainly is some trends in the industry by buyers that are shifting towards this digital consumption of information. And so the question is, as a manufacturing company, are you going to adapt to that trend by your buyers? Or are you going to stick with the old ways and try to force them to accommodate your sales funnel, so to speak?
Yeah. And I think many of those things that you've just identified, right? So I think traditionally, most of these companies, like you said, maybe are doing marketing, but they're not playing the right type of games. Typically, that means that they probably just spend money on, brochures, maybe some promotional products, and go into those trade shows and maybe buying an ad on their industry journal. So those things, they do have values, but at the same time, they probably are not where your ideal customers are consuming content or actively engaging their suppliers, prospective suppliers. So that also means that they're probably missing the boat in terms of reaching those right people. And then when they do cancel those things, they really didn't see much change in their overall exposure or the number of leads that generated from whatever they were doing before.
Yeah. So I think it goes back to what you said earlier. It's really a change of perception when it comes to marketing. It's like we weren't spending any money or we're spending a little bit of money, but you can't extrapolate that number, right? Of like, well, we spent $1,000 or $10,000 or $20,000 or whatever that number is. And here's all the new customers we brought on, because those are two separate things. The customers you bring on are not really because of those marketing initiatives that you're doing, because admittedly, those marketing initiatives were basically just to save face in front of your existing customers. So just kind of going through the motions there. So we've looked at a couple of different things when it comes to percentages and how much you can spend and what the averages are in the industry. So Sam, what would you say, I guess, walk us through your process when it comes to, we're working with a company who's posed this question to us. How do we establish a marketing budget? What should our marketing budget be for 2022? What are the steps that we take in order to determine what that looks like?
Yeah, I think the first order of business is first and foremost, making sure that they understand and value marketing as an investment, not as an expense, right? So I think we have to get that mindset fixed first, even though that seems very simple and obvious. But I think if they don't have the mindset, marketing is an investment, they will always try to find a way to cut that budget, right? So that'll be the first order of business that you have to do. The second thing I think you have to address is the growth stage of the company. So if you're a hyper growth company, you're in a stage where you need to consistently find ways to reach new customers and continue to add top line revenue and get as much of the market share as possible, then you need to be investing according to that growth, not according to just your top line revenue from your prior year, right? And if you're also, let's just say if you're an established company, what you're looking for consistent growth, then you need to invest according to that company's size and the growth that you're expecting to have in the coming year. So the growth stage of the organization does matter. The other thing would be just the industry trend that you're perceiving. So if you're seeing a lot of drastic changes in the industry, whether it be some sort of a regulation that's going to affect how you do business or how you sell your product, or any of those things that might affect what you do today, or you're seeing maybe major players are acquiring other competitors that you have and they're growing at a faster pace than you can keep up with, then you probably need to think about ways to increase your investment into marketing to make sure that you are growing your market share, the audience that actually know that you exist, right? So that you're investing according to that. So, and then the last thing that I would say is essentially really understanding your sales funnel and what it actually takes to drive that sales funnel, meaning how many leads do we need to have in the sales funnel to reach our revenue target? How many of those, what is our closing percentages? What is our average deal size? What are our lifetime value per customer? So knowing those metrics would help you determine how much should you be investing into building up that sales funnel. For what I mean is, if you actually know your lifetime value of a customer and your average order size, and then you know your growth targets, then you can say, okay, and then if you also know your cost of acquisition of that customer, then you can actually start to do some math, figuring out, okay, if our average cost per acquisition is $2,500 or $5,000, and our growth goal is a certain dollar amount, right? Let's say $1 million or $2 million, whatever that dollar amount is, then you have to do a multiple of whatever that cost of acquisition times the number of customer it would take to reach that revenue target, and then invest according to that into your company's marketing. So those are some of high level things that I would recommend we look at as a company, right? When you're planning your marketing budget for the coming year.
Yeah, I think that's a great process to go through. And really, whenever we get asked that question, it's almost like we have to start asking questions back, right? Because I don't think it's as simple as if you're in X industry, you need to spend 3% of your revenue or 10% of your revenue on marketing. I think you made a couple of good points about kind of the growth stage, where you're at, the size of the company, how much you want to grow, and really understanding and knowing your metrics and your funnel. That piece, I believe, a lot of companies underestimate their actual cost of acquisition, right? Because they don't take into account the entire sales process. They don't take into account their overhead in terms of their internal marketing employees, their internal sales employees, whatever that quoting process. I mean, we work with a lot of manufacturing companies that there's, full-time sales reps, and then they have, marketing, and then an outside marketing agency. And then in order to quote, they have to work with engineers and do some sort of mock-ups or product design, and they spend a lot of time on like R&D and then put the quote together. And it's a very involved process in order to just send out a quote. And then on top of that, maybe only 10% of those quotes turn into customers. And so we look at them, you do the math and you just say, how much did we spend on marketing, on outside expenses? We spent money on Google Ads or this trade show. And then how many new leads do we get, or how many new customers do we get? And we do the math that way on the cost per lead or cost per acquisition. We don't account for any of those other variables and factors. So knowing your numbers, I think, is really important. And once you know those numbers, then, as I mentioned, you kind of have to start asking these questions. Instead of how much should I spend on marketing, it's, well, how many new clients are we looking to bring on in 2022, right? What is the lifetime value of those customers? And start asking yourself, basically, how much can I afford to spend? Regardless of your cost of acquisition today, like, what's the ceiling on that? How much can we afford to spend to acquire a customer that will still be profitable? And how do we want to measure that? Are we looking at first order size? Are we looking at annual value? Are we looking at a 3 or 5 year window? Depends on your business model, right? Are you in a recurring revenue type business, or are you in a one-off project? How big are those projects? How do customers typically work with you, right? If you're in a manufacturing space, maybe they come in and it's a $10,000 or $5,000 deal. And maybe it costs you $5,000 to acquire that customer. And you might look at it and say, hey, this isn't sustainable. But maybe that $5,000 deal is just the entryway into that customer. And you prove your value to them. You do everything that you always say of, hey, we have great customer experience, fast turnaround time, quality products. And then next week they come back and order another 5,000, or maybe this is just a test. They're doing a prototype, and then next year they order 200,000. So I like to look at it in terms of like that lifetime value of the customer, and maybe look at that of like a 5-year window if that's your business model, right? If clients stay with you for 5 years, how does that look? And then start asking yourself, how much can we afford to spend in order to reach our revenue goals? So those are the type of questions you have to start asking. How much does it cost, like you said, right now to acquire a customer? And then how much do we want to make next year? So that's the other piece of the problem when it comes to, we spend 5% of our gross revenue. Well, 5% of your gross revenue today, right? Or 5% of your gross revenue last year. Well, how much do we want to be next year? And what percentage growth is that for you as a company? Which is another big question that people, I think, forget. It's a much, much different. If we're talking about, hey, let's add $1 million in new revenue. Well, if you're a $10 million company and you're adding $1 million in revenue, is much different than a $3 million company that's trying to go from 3 to 4 million, right? That's a big jump in their percentage compared to a 10 million or 100 million. If you're a $100 million company and you increase your marketing and you grew by 3%, like that's a huge growth in revenue. Whereas if you're a $1 million company, you grow by 3%, you're probably going to lose money because you spent so much more trying to grow, right? So those are the questions you have to ask. And for me, my favorite way to do that would be based on the cost of acquisition, right? Basically, if you're unfamiliar, the cost of acquisition is just your total spend on marketing. I would also include sales in that, marketing and sales, divided by the number of new customers, right? So if you're a manufacturing company, let's say you went to 4 trade shows, between the travel, the exhibits, the trade shows, the time that you spent there, all those kind of things, meals. Let's say you spent $20,000 each on those trade shows, which is a pretty conservative estimate, honestly. 4 trade shows, $20,000 is $80,000 in marketing. Let's say you got 6 new customers from that, okay? So just on that simple math is $13,300, $13.3 thousand in cost of acquisition. So for every $13,000 we spend, we got a new customer. Those other questions we're asking, well, what is the average contract value? So let's just assume in the scenario that each of those customers on average is about $100,000 in annual revenue. That means we spent $13.3 thousand. We brought on $100,000 in revenue. If the average client stays 5 years, now that $13,000 spend returns us $500,000 in revenue. So if we look at those same numbers based on what we said, it's like, okay, now if I want to grow, take that cost of acquisition and multiply by the number of new clients that I want to bring on. So if I want to bring on 10 new customers for $1 million in revenue, right? 100,000 times 10, then I would need to spend $133,000 on marketing. So $133,000 to get that $1 million in return. So again, that's regardless of, your total revenue as an organization. You're only spending to acquire the additional customers, right? So you're not spending marketing typically on the current. So if you look at that, that's 13% of the $1 million is $133,000 in order to get there. And then the other thing is like, okay, if we want to get an additional 10 customers, because a lot of times we're already getting, what we're doing is we're already getting those 6 customers from those trade shows. Now, how do we get an additional $1 million in growth? Well, now we need to spend $213,000 on marketing based on those cost of acquisition numbers. So you look at that, and then you can start asking those questions of, is that sustainable for us? Are there even more trade shows for us to go to, right? Did we already pick those top 4 trade shows? We're getting those costs and we got 6 new customers. Is that scalable, right? If we want to double that, can we go to 8 trade shows? Like, where are those trade shows? Are our customers there? Are we going to get another 6 new customers? So this is just to kind of get the framework around how much you're spending currently on your cost of acquisition. And then you start looking at, is there a more scalable, more effective way to do that? And at what point does a volume help that, right? So you look at your website, and the same as that trade show is like, we spend the money on the trade show. There's 1,000 people there. Only 10 of them actually had quality conversations, and maybe one of them turned out to be a customer. You look at your website in the same, you could do that in the same scenarios. Like, how many people do we have to get to our website in order to get a lead? How many leads do we have to get in order to get a customer? And how much will it cost us to get those people to our website and start kind of through that funnel? A trade show doesn't work that way, right? Like, it's pretty impossible for that trade show to, if it had 1,000 people at it before, next year is not going to have 10,000 people to it, right? It doesn't typically happen that way. So those aren't usually scalable ways where you can just keep pumping more into it at volume in order to lower that cost of acquisition. But your website, your marketing, your online marketing collateral and assets, that is scalable because you only spend it for it essentially one time. And then every time more people come to the website, we continue to reap the benefits. So for me, I think those costs of acquisition costs go down at volume only through digital versus traditional efforts.
Yeah, and one thing I would add to that is, basically you gave the math of assuming that you acquired 6 customers, which it'd be awesome if you went to 4 trade shows and you walk away with 6 customers and each one is 100,000 and lifetime value of $500,000 is amazing. But oftentimes what you typically walk away with business cards. So if you just look at the business cards as a lead, let's just say you got 50 business cards at each of those shows that are reasonably quality conversations. You take those 80,000 divided by the 200, now you end up with $400 per lead, right? So in the same scenario, even if you haven't closed them, you just spend $400 to get a business card. So you also need to look at that cost per lead side as well, right? Maybe they don't all convert into a sale. And then now you have to justify, hey, if I'm spending $400 at a trade show to get a 1 business card, how much am I willing to actually invest without ever having to get out of my office? Can I drive more contacts and leads at a much cost per lead or a cost per form fill? And I think you could do that much more efficiently with digital than you could ever with any sort of virtual event or live events.
Right. And that's where, again, I think a lot of companies are underestimating their cost of acquisition because they don't account for exactly what you just talked about. They don't account for the actual sales velocity or that sales cycle length. And so for those 6, those, like you said, 10 business cards or 10 leads that you got, right? Leads that you got from that trade show. Yeah, if you're just looking at getting those people's email addresses, I mean, you could buy, ZoomInfo or any of those kind of tools and get those email addresses for a couple bucks versus $400 or $1,000 or whatever it really costs you to get that. And then if it takes you 6 months or sometimes 6 years to close that business, how much is that costing you too, right? So if there's a more efficient way to market at scale and then only handle higher quality leads, even if they cost you the same amount, just for the sake of the argument, even if it costs you that same amount, and those leads close much faster because they're ready to purchase because you've done a better job with your marketing, your website, your marketing, your videos, that part does that nurturing for you. And the actual time that it takes from initial contact, working with the sales reps, get a quote, get them to sign a contract is shorter. I mean, that ROI is infinite because now you're getting time back, right? So to me, a lot of times companies don't account for that sales velocity as a part of their ROI or their cost of acquisition. And I think that's a huge mistake.
Yeah. And the one other thing that I thought about too is, you've mentioned earlier, the stats that you read off, like 76% of the people go look at your website, and only about 13% of their time is spent talking to a customer, to a vendor or supplier. And more, about 3% of that actually is with one vendor or something, right? You had some of those metrics. So, and then I forgot some of the other metrics that you had in terms of how early they were starting that journey or the research, how much time they were actually doing all of those planning and researching and learning, right? Reading content. So if you think about it, then what you're actually seeing is Google essentially is the biggest trade show floor, and maybe even LinkedIn, and then probably even YouTube, right? Think about those as trade show floors.
The internet in general, right?
Yeah, you have opportunity to be creating information, making it available for people in their buying journey to go consume that and actually make that purchase decision while you're doing whatever else that you might be doing on your sales and marketing initiative. So from that perspective alone, I think just investing into digital channels to create content, make yourself the go-to place for information and education, that would drive tremendous amount of inquiries and leads at a much lower cost per lead, and hopefully at a much lower cost per acquisition as well.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, there's so many factors. I think we said at the beginning is like, when you're looking at it from the wrong perspective, you're playing the wrong game. And it's always going to be hard for you to wrap your head around how this shift in marketing is going to have an impact, because you're so used to it's a different customer base, right? If you're talking about this traditional method, trade shows, those type of, think about the people that are going to trade shows, right? To still find new vendors, new suppliers. They're the late adopters, right? Because they're not the ones that are online consuming content, all those kind of things. Like they might be, but we looked at like the 83% of engineers. We talk about a younger generation of engineers that's coming up, starting to get into leadership positions, shaking things up, right? When it comes to purchase decisions. So those old school relationship trade show customers, like they also are going to take longer to make a purchase decision because they're already admittedly the late adopters. They're the ones still going to trade shows. So like it's a completely different customer base that you're going after. And so you have to adapt a lot of different strategies. Your marketing has to change. Your sales process has to change because you're talking to different people, right? And so one thing I wanted to look at just based on that old model that we talked about of like a percentage of existing, gross revenue, I think a lot of companies are underestimating their cost of acquisition. I also think a lot of companies are underspending depending on the size of the company. And I think smaller companies may be overspending depending on the size of the company because they're underestimating their cost of acquisition. So just a couple of numbers, right? If we're looking at, round numbers here, $10 million company, manufacturing company, we said the average was anywhere from 3 to 8% of gross revenue. So the high end of that 8% of 10 million is $800,000 in marketing. You and I both know a lot of manufacturing companies in that 10 million to even $100 million range that are not spending $800,000 on their marketing. Maybe they're getting closer to that number if you start accounting for the actual cost of acquisition. Like I said, companies are underestimating that. The time that they're spending on sales, the sales velocity, all those kind of things. They're spending engineers' time. So you take a percentage of that engineer's salary, how much their time. But really, they're not. I mean, a lot of companies are not spending anywhere near that. And as a $10 million company, I don't know that you need to spend $800,000 in marketing if you're doing it the right way. But when you're not spending that amount of money and you then go ask, hey, I think we need to spend $200,000 on marketing, and everything you've done before was internal, so you're not correctly calculating that cost of acquisition, it seems like a big number. So we look at the low end of that, 3% is $300,000, right? And so I think this is probably more realistic for what I see in the industry. So I agree with this stat of how much companies are actually spending on their marketing when you calculate the cost of acquisition correctly. So $300,000, again, when you account for trade shows, engineers' time, a lot of time we don't have true sales reps. If we do, we might have a couple of outside sales reps. Maybe we have to buying them vehicles, cars, all these expenses, right? So phone bills, all those sorts of things. I think that's probably closer to 300,000, but I think we get our hands tied so much by those internal kind of basically overhead that we're not truly investing $300,000 again into like real acquisition strategies. So those are those numbers. If you're a $10 million company, anywhere from 300 to 800,000 in marketing spend if you follow that model. The biggest problem I see, I think that's okay for those companies because I think there's enough there that you can get creative with the spend. The problem that I see is with the smaller manufacturing companies. You see this a lot with SaaS companies. Back to your point about like what growth stage are you in? Because if you're a $2 million company and you're looking at, well, we'll spend 3% of our gross revenue, that's only $60,000. $2 million company, you say, okay, we'll spend 5% of our gross revenue, that's only $100,000, right? In reality, what we see, especially with these high growth companies, these SaaS companies, this is why they go out and raise outside capital, because they're trying to get to a goal, right? So if we're 2 million and we want to get to 3 million, like that number we looked at earlier of like how much do you spend for new marketing? If we're 2 million and we only want to spend 3% of our marketing, that's $60,000. But what they do is they hire 3 SDRs, sales development reps, 2 account executives. We have a marketing person, probably a marketing agency. We're investing into collateral. We're doing webinars, trainings. We're creating a bunch of ebooks. We're trying to fill our salespeople's pipelines, right, with high volume of leads, which requires a lot of SDRs to follow up like crazy on these ebook downloads and webinar attendees. We're spending, you've seen, right? We're mailing people actual physical, gifts to try to get them to book a meeting. We're buying them lunch to listen to a demo, whatever we can to fill our pipeline of vanity metrics essentially. And we're investing heavily into a bunch of technology, right? So we have sales outreach and cadence tools. We have data collection tools, data enrichment tools. We have all the MarTech in the book. We have CRM investment. We probably have some sort of administrator for the CRM and the marketing, operations and marketing tech. And so you look at all that, and we haven't even talked about promoting any content or anything along those lines in terms of marketing. We're just talking about our infrastructure, so to speak. So that overhead cost is way more than if we're a $2 million company, and that's a structure, which is only 5 employees, right? And probably an agency. That's sales and marketing. This is where I think a lot of companies are overspending on the wrong efforts because they're following that old kind of waterfall method of we need 1,000 leads to turn into, 50 opportunities to close, 1% of those. And it's like, that is not going to be scalable because you're going to continue to overspend on all of this cost of acquisition that you're not calculating correct.
Yeah. I think the dichotomy here is if you're in the smaller, sector, right? And from a revenue standpoint, I think your growth stage need to determine how much you would invest. And I'm all about that. But I think if you're in that middle stage you talked about, maybe a mid-market company, maybe not, they're still a small company. If you're talking about manufacturing companies doing $10 million, and you have a lot of infrastructure, warehouse, equipments, all of those things still need to be add to that. I think at that level, your growth really need to determine how much you're properly investing into the growth. And like you said, if you have 2 or 3 internal marketing people and the salespeople and you do trade shows, you probably are getting there, but you're probably still underspending because you're just investing into just headcount and maybe some tactics that you just believe is working, but not necessarily really as efficient or effective as some of the things that we've just talked about here.
Mm-hmm. All right. So the key takeaway, I think if you're listening to this and you didn't get the answer you were looking for, I think that is the answer. There's no blanket statement. There's no one size fits all. The answer is you have to really know your numbers, know your company, know your business, know your numbers, know your customers, and then make the decision based on the delta, right? Based on where you want to be, what that changes, and what percentage of that can we afford to spend in order to acquire customers. So you really have to know your lifetime value of your customer in order to confidently make that decision of, we're willing to spend 10% of that, acquisition cost on that, annual contract value or whatever that is. Obviously, high growth companies, tech companies, outside investments, whatever, they can afford to spend more on that. As you see that we talked about, Amazon and Uber and those type of companies all the time. It's like, who can spend the most to acquire customers for the longest time? They're going to win in the long run. But you have cash flow considerations to make. And I think that's why it's so much harder for these older manufacturing companies because they've always done it. They've never raised outside capital. Only loans they've taken out was for purchase of a building or purchase of equipment. It was much more straightforward ROI calculations, much easier to understand. And so the idea of slimming up our margins in the short term in order to win in the long term is kind of foreign idea because we've always had X% of profitability. I don't want to cut into that, right? Because as the owner of the business or as senior leadership, that directly impacts my income, earning capabilities, right? Whereas these high growth, outside capital investment companies, they're spending house money, right? So they're not positive. And like that idea within like Silicon Valley, like type of companies is like, no one expects to be cash flow positive for, 5 years, 10 years, or whatever that number is. A lot of times these companies are selling for 10x multiples of their revenue, and there's never been profitable a day in their life, right? But everyone's still getting paid. So I think you just have to know your numbers and know your industry to know how that works. I'm not suggesting to do that as a manufacturing company because you have a lot more overhead and expenses. You're walking on a higher wire there when it comes to that risk. So just know your numbers, know your true cost of acquisition, acquisition, set some targets for what that cost of acquisition should be or what you can afford it to be, and then do the math based on that delta, again, that growth that you want to see over the next 12 to 18 months. And that should give you some idea of how much you might have to spend and how in line or in the same vein is your new expenditure with your current cost of acquisition. So that goes back to what we were talking about with those trade shows of what we're really spending now. Are we really acquiring customers? Is that going to translate that same cost of acquisition towards digital? Or is the goal to now lower that, right? So we reallocate those budgets, we reshuffle and shift the way that our team is structured internally, and then truly spend that same amount of money that we were spending on digital channels and see what could happen there. So it's not always about spending more. It could be about reallocating some of those funds that you weren't really accounting correctly for. Hopefully you learned something today. If you have any thoughts on how your company does their budgeting that may be different than ours, we'd love to hear that. And if you want to kind of understand how you can do this for your company, you have a hard time doing these calculations because again, it's not always as black and white as we make it seem here. So always feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to meet with you personally and help you make sense of all this. So please, if you enjoyed the podcast, give us a like, subscribe, share with a friend, share with a colleague, and of course, tune in for the next episode.
Growth Marketers is brought to you by One IMS, helping you reach new heights through integrated marketing. One world, one web, one IMS.